Little Orphan was sweeping the entire ranch. The owner came out and adopted her. What kind of child sweeps an entire ranch? Not for food, not for praise, but simply to prove she exists. She wasn't on any list. She didn't belong to anyone. She showed up with no shoes, no name anyone used, and started sweeping. Like maybe, if she could just keep the dust from settling, she wouldn't disappear herself. No one stopped her. Until one morning the rancher stepped outside and laid something down on the porch. A warm biscuit. That's where this story begins, but it's not where it ends. Because what follows is a quiet battle against a cold system, a house that becomes a home, and a man who learns that love doesn't require blood. It just requires showing up, again and again. This is a story of found family, of slow, steady healing, and of what happens when someone who was invisible is finally seen. Which part of this story touches your heart the most? Tell us in the comments below. And if this kind of storytelling. The wind wandered lazily across the dry boards of the ranch porch, stirring the old curtain made from a flour sack. Ruthie woke before the sun had burned off the morning frost, her breath visible in the pale air. The roosters had already crowed once. The broom was where she'd left it, leaning by the post like it was waiting for her. So she did what she always did. She swept. Quietly, carefully, not because someone asked her to, but because doing something, anything, made her feel like she might still exist. No one had ever told her she could stay, but no one had told her to leave either. That was how it worked here. She moved like a shadow between the chores, feeding chickens, carrying water, patching old rags, always just enough to not be noticed, never enough to be missed. That morning, though, something changed. Right there on the porch steps next to the faded boot scraper was a plate. On it sat a warm biscuit, still soft, still steaming like it had just come from a cast-iron skillet. Beside it, a glass of water, cool and clear. No note. No name, just waiting. She stood staring at it, unsure. Was it for her? Was it a mistake? Was it a test? Ruthie looked around, no one in sight. The porch door was shut. The horses hadn't stirred. The wind was the only witness. Her hands hesitated. Dirty fingers brushed against her worn dress as if trying to clean themselves without water. Then, carefully, she reached out. The biscuit was real, still warm, and when she broke it in two, it flaked just right. She didn't sit. She crouched like she was stealing time from the day and took a bite. It hit her harder than she expected. Not the flavor, not the butter or the salt, but something else, something that cracked in her chest like a thaw. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just eating. She was being fed. She finished it slowly, each bite a mix of hunger and hesitation, like it might vanish if she ate too fast. The water washed it down gently, cooling a throat that had held back too many words. Inside the house, the man who ran the ranch said nothing. He stood at the counter, cutting another biscuit. His hands were large and calloused, but they moved with a care he didn't show in his face. He placed the second biscuit on another plate. No note, no fanfare, just a quiet offering. And that's how it began, not with a promise, not with a welcome, but with a biscuit left out like a whisper that said, "I see you. You're not invisible here." It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't love. But to Ruthie, it was enough to begin believing. Maybe she wouldn't have to disappear this time. No one ever said, "You can stay." But no one asked her to leave either. That's how Ruthie learned the rhythm of belonging, not through words but through silence that didn't sting. The kind of silence that lets you stay if you can bear its weight. She started waking up earlier than the roosters, not because anyone told her to, just because the ranch had needs and she knew how to listen. The barn needed sweeping. The hens needed feeding. The horse blankets were worn through at the seams. She found a sewing kit in a drawer no one used and patched them up like she'd been born to stitch things that were falling apart. Some days, she didn't even know if the man noticed. He never said thank you, never asked her what she was doing, but tools left out were suddenly put back. Boots were lined straighter by the door. A basket of eggs she'd gathered was gone the next morning and replaced by fresh straw. One afternoon she found a pair of boots on the porch, smaller than the ones she'd been clomping around in, worn but polished, and beside them a folded pair of socks that didn't smell like anyone else's feet. She didn't ask. She didn't bring them inside. She just put them on and they fit like they remembered her. It was like that day after day. No declarations, no hugs, but something was changing, slow and steady, like spring thawing into itself. Sometimes she caught the man watching her, not with suspicion, not with pity, but with that quiet recognition people give to something they've come to rely on without realizing it. Like a sunrise or a fence that never falls. He wasn't a talker, but he didn't stop her either. That was enough. And in that quiet space, Ruthie began to bloom, not loudly, not quickly, but with roots. She never said it out loud, but every egg gathered, every shirt mended, every pile of hay she stacked was her way of saying thank you. For not sending her away, for letting her stay even if just by doing nothing at all. Sometimes gratitude doesn't need a stage, just a place to put your hands, a pair of boots that fit, and a silence that feels less like absence and more like home. The rain came down hard that evening, flattening the grass and soaking the brittle edges of the barn roof. The kind of rain that didn't just fall, it stayed, hung in the air like a warning. The wind had teeth, and it bit through her thin sleeves as Ruthie gathered the buckets and tucked the hens in early. Her room, if you could call it that, was a hayloft above the stables, with a pile of old quilts stuffed in the corner like forgotten seasons. She curled up into herself, jacket still damp, arms wrapped tight. Rain tapped the boards above her in restless rhythms. She listened to it like a song she didn't know how to sing along with. She wasn't used to comfort, so she didn't expect it to come, but it did. A knock, just once. The barn door creaked open, and there he was, tall and silent, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He didn't speak right away, just looked around, then stepped toward the makeshift corner she called hers. In his hands, folded neat and dry, was a blanket. Not just any blanket, lavender in color, edged with tiny stitched flowers. The kind of softness you don't buy cheap. The kind someone had once made with care. He held it out. She didn't move. "Take it," he said quietly, setting it on the bale near her. "You'll catch something if you stay wet." She reached for it slowly, like it might vanish. It didn't. It was warm to the touch, fresh from wherever warmth was still kept in that quiet house. As she pulled it around her shoulders, something in her posture changed. Less guard, more gravity. Less waiting to be scolded, more resting into the possibility she wouldn't be. He turned to leave. Just before stepping out into the rain, he paused, voice low and almost unsure, like the words weren't used to leaving his mouth. Sleep well, got chores tomorrow. The door shut behind him with a soft thud, and that was it. But for Ruthie, it was more than enough. It wasn't the blanket itself. It was what it meant, that someone saw her discomfort and did something about it. Not because she earned it, not because she was useful, but because she was cold. And that somehow. It started with silence. Not the kind that settles soft in the evening air, but the kind that wraps around your chest and makes breathing feel like a risk. That morning, the rancher walked out to the porch with a letter in hand, creased, official-looking, and already heavy before it was read. His boots hit the boards harder than usual. Ruthie, sweeping feed near the coop, paused mid-motion. She knew a letter like that didn't come for nothing. He read it once, then again, slower. The wind teased at the edges, lifting the paper as if it, too, wanted to know what came next. He didn't flinch, just reached for a match. Ruthie watched from behind the fence. She wasn't close enough to see the words, but she could read the moment clearly. It was about her. He lit the match, held it under the corner until the flame caught. He didn't toss the paper aside. He watched it burn every inch until it was no longer ink and command, just ash and choice. Then he walked back inside as if nothing had happened, but something had. That evening he left without a word, saddlebags full, hat low. Rode out as the sun dipped and the land turned gold, like he was chasing the last light on purpose. Ruthie stood at the edge of the yard, fingers knotted in her skirt, waiting for a goodbye that never came. She didn't sleep. By the time the roosters stirred, he was back, mud on his cuffs, paperwork rolled beneath his arm, eyes darker than yesterday. He didn't explain, just poured himself coffee, stared out the window like the horizon might speak back. Then came Bragg. He arrived in a creaky wagon, glasses fogged from the morning chill, briefcase in hand. Ruthie didn't know him, but she knew the look, one of those men who measured things in check boxes. He spoke gently, not like a stranger, but like someone used to helping folks finish things they couldn't say out loud. He asked questions about her name, her age, her parents. She gave what she could. The rest lived in silence. "Do you feel safe here?" he asked. She looked over toward the man who'd burned a letter rather than follow it, who hadn't said she belonged but never once made her feel like she didn't. "Yes," she answered. Not because she knew what safe meant, but because, for the first time, she wasn't afraid to stay. Papers were signed in quiet. That night, over a creaking table with just the fire for company, the man spoke. Not in speeches, not in softness, just one line: "You're not going anywhere." It landed in her chest like a heartbeat she hadn't heard before. The kind that meant home. The kind that said, "I see you. I've chosen you. I'll keep choosing." The wind had turned sharp that evening, brushing against the ranch house like fingers tapping out a warning on the windows. The fire had gone low, but Ruthie didn't add wood. She sat still, half listening to the creaks in the floorboards, half thinking about the way silence settles in a place once it stops being empty. It wasn't loneliness anymore. Not really. Just quiet. The kind you earn after too many nights wondering if someone might come back for you and finally learning no one would, but still deciding to stay kind anyway. That's why she heard it, 3 knocks, soft, uneven. She didn't hesitate. Her feet were bare. The floor was cold. She crossed it quickly, quietly, and opened the door without asking who it was. There they stood, 2 figures against the wind, wet and shivering. Hazel, older than Ruthie but still young enough to look lost. Her eyes darted behind her like she expected someone to follow. In her arms, a small boy with a cough that rattled in his chest. They said nothing. Didn't need to. Ruthie knew what it meant to knock and hope no one said no. She stepped aside just like that, not because she had permission to, not because anyone told her she should, but because someone once made room for her in the dark. No questions, no papers, just a biscuit and a blanket. They sat by the fire. Ruthie made tea with honey, the last bit in the jar, and handed it to Hazel like it wasn't a sacrifice. Hazel's hands shook when she took it. The boy coughed again, then fell asleep on a rug still smelling faintly of hay. She didn't ask names that night. Some names only come when a child feels safe enough to say them. The next morning, the rancher came into the kitchen, pausing just long enough to take in the new faces. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. But he laid out 3 bowls instead of 1 and filled each with oatmeal, extra sugar on top. Hazel looked at him for the first time then, not like someone afraid, but like someone trying to believe what she saw. After breakfast, she swept the porch. Later, she mended a sleeve that wasn't hers. She didn't say thank you, but sometimes showing up is enough. A week later, another knock came. A boy this time, thin, hollow-eyed, no older than 10, with calloused hands and silence deeper than Ruthie had ever known. He didn't speak a word for 3 days, just worked. He cleaned stalls, fixed a hinge, fed chickens before anyone else woke up. When asked his name, he shrugged. But one night by the fire, he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, a page torn from a Bible. On it the verse was underlined, "I will not leave you as orphans." He didn't have to say anything after that. Then came Clara, sharp-tongued, defensive, angry at everything and everyone, especially herself. She didn't want help. She didn't ask for it. But when Ruthie showed her how to milk the goats, Clara stayed. When she fell asleep by the fire one night, no one moved her. When she cried quietly into the sleeves of a coat too big for her, no one mentioned it. They were becoming something. Not a family, not yet, but something stitched together from silence and second chances. Ruthie started noticing the door more. It had no lock, hadn't for a while. One night she sat by it waiting. Not out of fear, but out of expectation. She kept an extra blanket by the chair just in case. The kind of just in case that says, "I've been you, I remember, I'll be ready." She began to understand something. There's a difference between being rescued and choosing to rescue. Someone had once chosen to keep her. Now she was choosing to open the door. And maybe that's how homes are built, not with blueprints or bricks, but with the soft thud of feet in the hallway, a mug left full for a stranger, and the sound of a lock that never clicks shut. Because once you've been the knock, You never forget the courage it takes to lift your hand and hope someone's listening. The snow had come early that year, thick and fast, blanketing the land in a hush that made even the roosters whisper. It piled along the fences, softened the roof lines, and muffled the usual sounds of work. But inside the house, warmth buzzed, quiet laughter, soup simmering, boots drying by the fire. They were up to 7 now, 7 kids, none of them planned, all of them still half listening for the sound of being sent away. Then one morning a black carriage cut through the white. A man stepped out, overcoat stiff from the frost, gloves creased, face pale but practiced. He didn't knock, just walked up the steps and announced. He was with the Department of Child Welfare. Hazel froze mid-stir at the stove. Clara disappeared into the barn. The youngest boy dropped his spoon. The rancher, Colt, stood by the door, silent as always. He nodded once, motioned the man inside. Paperwork followed. Names, birth dates, room counts, regulations. "There are too many children here," the inspector said flatly. "This is unauthorized housing. These children need proper facilities, supervision, licensing." He kept talking, words like oversight, endangerment, custody. Colt didn't interrupt, didn't argue, he just listened. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "I'll fix it." That night he didn't eat, didn't sit by the fire. He packed a bag, strapped it tight, and saddled the mare himself. The snow was still falling, thick and wet, the kind that clings to your boots and doesn't let go. Town was nearly 15 miles away. Roads were impassable, visibility near zero, but he went anyway. No one told him to. No one would have blamed him if he waited. But by dawn he was already halfway there. It took him most of the day to make it. At the town hall, they said the clerk had gone home. He waited. When she returned, breathless and startled to find anyone still standing outside, he simply handed her a folded stack of forms. Adoption affidavits, legal guardianship petitions, housing waivers, medical consent. He had it all. Filled out, signed, time-stamped, each one an act of love disguised in bureaucracy. His hands were cracked from the cold, bleeding slightly where the skin had split from gripping reins too long. His coat was soaked through, but his signature didn't shake. "Can we process these now?" he asked. They did. He rode home with the papers tucked inside his shirt near his chest. They were still warm when he handed them to Ruthie. "Put these somewhere safe," he said, like he was asking her to guard treasure. She looked at his hands, the cuts, the frostbitten knuckles, the silence behind his eyes. "You didn't have to go through all that," she whispered. He looked at her, tired but clear. "Didn't have to, just did." There was no metal, no crowd waiting at the door. Just the sound of soup boiling, the smell of wood smoke, and the slow unfolding of relief across every child's face. From that day on, none of them ever asked if they'd have to leave again. The law may not have had a heart, but someone did. And he'd crossed a frozen world just to make sure they could stay. He hadn't slept. Not the night before the inspector came. Not the night after. The ranch was quiet by then, kids tucked into corners of warmth, blankets too short, boots too big, but hearts beginning to rest. He sat at the kitchen table long after the fire turned to ash, fingers stained with ink and worry. Every form asked the same thing in different ways. Why do you want to keep them? He didn't know how to answer that on paper. Because Hazel's laugh sounded like windows opening in spring. Because the boy from the copper camp now fed the horses before anyone else woke up. Because Clara no longer looked over her shoulder when someone said her name. Because Ruthie no longer flinched when she dropped a dish. He didn't love them like a father, not yet. Maybe not ever in the way books describe, but he knew what it meant to be alone. And more than that, he knew what it meant to not be sent away. He wasn't going to let the law erase what they were building. Not this time. The trip through the snow wasn't brave. It was necessary. There were moments halfway through the pass when he lost feeling in his left hand. His horse stumbled once, nearly throwing him. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Every mile was a signature written in cold. Every gust of wind was a question. Do you mean it? Every answer was the next step forward. By the time he reached the town hall, his coat had iced at the seams. The clerk opened the door not because she saw him, but because the dog barked. She gasped when she realized he'd been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, still as the post he leaned on. "You all right, sir?" she asked. He didn't nod, didn't smile. Just handed her the stack held tight in gloved fingers he could barely move. She looked through them, eyes widening. This covers 7 children," she whispered. "Are they all yours?" He looked past her shoulder as if seeing home. "They are now." That's all he said. She sat him down, brought him coffee. He didn't drink it until the last form was stamped. Then he folded them with care, not just to protect the ink but the promise. On the ride home, the wind had softened. The world was still white, but something in him had settled. He'd faced the coldest part of the world, and it wasn't the snow. It was the system that saw children as numbers. He came back with papers, but he carried more than that. He carried the weight of a decision made in silence and sealed in frost. Ruthie watched him ride in from the window and met him at the steps. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know. You didn't have to go alone." He looked down at her, then back at the house where 7 children were now waiting for bedtime stories, and said quietly, the earth was beginning to soften, though the snow still clung in the corners like regrets that refused to melt. You could smell the thaw coming, mud, wet wood, the faint promise of green under months of white. Ruthie was planting onion bulbs by the back fence when the sound of hooves pulled her gaze toward the road. The dust hadn't risen like usual, too cold still, too quiet. A black carriage moved along the edge of the horizon, sharp against the gray. Not the kind that belonged in these parts, not the kind anyone welcomed. Inside the house, Hazel had just braided her hair, something she only did when she was trying to feel steadier than she was. By the time the wheels crunched over gravel and stopped at the porch, Ruthie was already moving toward her. "Don't," Hazel said softly, tying the braid off. "I need to." The door creaked open before the man even knocked. He hadn't changed much. Tall, clean-cut in a way that looked more like a mask than a habit. He wore a coat that hadn't seen labor, boots too polished for country roads. His jawline was tight with certainty, his eyes thin with ownership. Hazel stepped onto the porch before he spoke. He didn't smile, didn't blink. Time to come home, he said, like no time had passed, like the bruises hadn't happened, like she hadn't run, she didn't move. I'm not your home, she answered. He scoffed, short, dismissive. You're my blood, that means something. She tilted her head just slightly. It meant something when I cried and you left, when I flinched and you told me to toughen up. It meant something when you locked the door from the outside. His nostrils flared. You don't get to talk to me like that. Colt had stepped out by then, quiet, steady, no expression. He held a thin folder in one hand, papers signed in winter, not for this moment, but because he'd known it might come. Hazel's under my care now, he said. Fully, legally. You've got no say. The man didn't reach for the folder. Just stared. You think this fixes her? He asked, voice low, bitter. She's broken, always was. Hazel's spine straightened. Not with anger, not with pride, just something older, deeper, a stillness she'd earned. I'm not broken, she said. You just never saw the parts of me that worked. He laughed again, but it didn't land. The porch didn't echo it back. No one smiled, not even the sky. Clouds hung heavy as if holding their breath. I should take this to court, he muttered. You can, Colt said calmly, but it won't change anything. You lost her the day she stopped waiting at that window. Hazel didn't cry, she didn't shake. But her hands, folded over her stomach, tightened just slightly. The man glanced behind her, at the open door, the boots too small for him lined neatly by the mat, the sound of children inside. You're building yourself a nice little orphanage, he sneered. Colt didn't flinch. We're building a home. That was the last thing said. The man turned, stiff and bitter, and walked down the steps like the world owed him something it refused to pay. The carriage pulled away slower than it had come. Hazel didn't watch it leave. She stepped back inside, her braids slipping over her shoulder like armor she'd outgrown. Inside, Clara handed her a mug of tea without speaking. One of the boys passed her a biscuit, small things, but every movement said the same thing. You were brave. You're still here. We saw. That evening, as the sun broke low beneath the clouds, Ruthie found Hazel alone by the barn. I thought I'd feel something, Hazel said, like anger or fear. And did you? Ruthie asked. No, Hazel answered. I just felt tall. Ruthie smiled. That's how you know you're done being small for someone else's comfort. Spring came slow to the ranch. Not with fanfare, but with the small signs only those who'd been watching all winter would notice. The ground softening under bare feet, a breeze that no longer bit but brushed, buds poking from fence posts where frost used to cling. Inside the house, something had changed, too, though no one said it out loud. Ruthie was still up before sunrise, but not to be told what to do. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew where everything belonged. When the fire needed more wood, she fed it. When coughs echoed in the night, she was already steeping mint tea. When the baby Hazel had brought whimpered at 3 a.m., Ruthie was there with a lullaby whispered like memory. It wasn't that Colt stepped back. It was that Ruthie had quietly stepped forward. She never called it leading, but everyone else followed. Clara arrived on a Tuesday. She didn't say where she'd come from, and no one asked. Her knuckles were scraped. Her shoes didn't match. She carried a bundle wrapped in an old quilt and held it like it was the last fragile thing left in her life. Ruthie opened the door before Clara knocked. There was no fanfare, no tears, just two girls meeting each other with the kind of glance that said, "I won't ask what you survived if you won't ask me either." Clara stayed. At first, she watched more than she worked. But soon she was sweeping the back steps before anyone asked, pulling weeds, teaching the younger kids how to wash behind their ears. One evening she sat beside Ruthie and said, quietly, "I didn't know kindness could last this long." 2 weeks later the boys from the copper camp arrived. One had a stutter. The other didn't speak at all. They didn't bring luggage, just a half loaf of bread wrapped in newspaper and a slingshot with no rubber left. When Ruthie handed them each a bowl of stew and said, "Eat slow, there's more," they looked at her like she was lying. But she was. There was always more. Not because the pantry was full, some nights it wasn't, but because someone had decided a long time ago that enough wasn't measured in portions but in welcome. The house didn't get bigger, but the floor did. Kids slept on quilts near the fire under tables, two to a cot. No one complained. Somehow there was always just enough space. And Ruthie, she stopped checking the calendar. Stopped asking how long she'd be allowed to stay. Because now she was the one making room, folding extra blankets, putting plates out without counting first, tucking in corners with the care of someone who remembered what it was like to wake up cold. One afternoon, Colt stood in the doorway, watching her teach one of the boys how to mend a sock. He didn't say anything, just nodded once when she caught his eye. Later that night, over dinner, he spoke up for the first time in days. "You've been keeping things together," he said. Ruthie blinked, surprised. "Just helping." "No," he said, "not just. You've become part of the beams in this place." It wasn't praise, it wasn't sentiment, it was recognition. And from a man like Colt, that meant more than any framed certificate or gold star. Ruthie didn't reply. She just smiled a little and passed the bread around. That night, after everyone was asleep, she stood by the fire a little longer than usual. She adjusted a log, watched the sparks flicker, laid another log on top, not because the fire was low, but because she knew someone else would need warmth come morning. That's what being the keeper of a home is, she realized. It's not about having the title. It's about remembering the cold so clearly that you make sure no one else feels it. One evening, Ruthie found herself by the kitchen window long after the dishes were washed and the laughter had faded into sleep. The moon cast long lines across the wooden floor and she stood still, watching the shadows sway. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't wondering if someone might come take her back, or if the next knock at the door would mean being sent away. She was listening, for the kettle when it whistled, for the sigh of a child who'd outgrown bad dreams, for the whisper of the ranch breathing steadily through the night. The ranch used to feel like someone else's world, built by hands she didn't know, guarded by rules she didn't understand. But now, when she swept the floor, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like someone polishing her own reflection from the wood. There was no ceremony to the moment she realized. This place isn't where I stay. It's who I am when I care for others the way I once needed caring. That night, she left the kitchen lamp on, not for herself, but in case someone else came looking for a place that felt like home in the dark. Because Ruthie understood now. The most important part of a house isn't its walls or even the roof. It's the fire someone keeps lit through the night so the next person doesn't have to walk into the cold. And that fire, it was hers to tend now. The first sign came not with a bang, but with a whisper. A letter, no name, folded into thirds and wedged between the porch floorboards. Ruthie found it early, just as dawn cracked open the sky with that soft, milky light only seen on quiet, expectant mornings. She bent down to pick it up, thinking it might be a child's drawing, but it was. The handwriting was clean, too clean, the message short. Enough. Stop before someone gets hurt. There was no threat of law, no demand for custody. Just an air of something bitter, like someone who'd watched from far away and decided they didn't like what they saw. Ruthie stood there for a moment. She didn't crumple the note, didn't run inside. She folded it back, tucked it into her apron, and went to check the animals. The second sign came 2 days later. The water from the well tasted metallic. Foul. Hazel noticed it first after giving the baby a sip. She spit it out fast enough to keep him safe. By the time Colt drew a bucket himself, the smell was undeniable. They stopped drinking from it, boiled river water instead. No one panicked, but the house felt tighter after that. Every door was double-latched. Every night ended with Ruthie counting heads just in case. Then the fence was cut, right near the back where the fields met the woods. Clean lines, like someone had taken wire cutters in the dark. The horses didn't run. Maybe even they knew they were safer behind broken fences than in open fields. Colt repaired it without speaking. The others asked questions. Who, why should we call someone? Ruthie didn't join in. She was upstairs, writing in her journal. Not out of fear, but out of something firmer. She wrote, "Some people think they can rattle you by shaking what they couldn't build. But we are not made of fence wire and water buckets. We are made of dinners that get passed down the table and quilts sewn in silence and names whispered at bedtime. We are not leaving. We are not asking permission. And we are not afraid." Then she tucked the journal beneath her mattress and lit the lamp by the window. Not because she needed the light, but because someone out there might see it and know they're still here. Because once you've been invisible and someone finally sees you, the worst thing you can do is go dark again. That night, Ruthie didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because she'd once lived in places where threats came without warning, and she'd promised herself. Never again would fear take the first seat at the table. Instead, she brewed tea and sat by the window, pen in hand, watching the horizon where the shadows clung to the edge of the trees. She wasn't looking for who did it. She was watching to remind herself that even shadows have borders. Downstairs, Colt made his usual round, checked the latches, stood a moment too long on the porch like he could smell history returning. When he came back in, he said nothing, just saw Ruthie by the window, gave a small nod and left the lamp burning. Neither of them needed to say what they knew. This ranch had become something bigger than land. It was an idea. A place where the forgotten could remember who they were without apology. And ideas, once rooted, were hard to uproot, no matter who tried. The children didn't sense all of it, but they felt enough. They stayed closer that week, spoke softer, left the last bite of bread untouched out of instinct more than manners. It was Clara who finally asked, "What if they come back?" Ruthie didn't give a lecture, she just said, "Then we stay anyway." Because that was the promise now, not just to each other but to the children they used to be. The ones who were silenced, displaced, taught to run when doors slammed. They weren't running any. The baby burned with fever by nightfall. 1 hour he was giggling in Hazel's lap, clutching her braid like it was a lifeline. The next, his body was limp, forehead slick with sweat, cheeks flushed too deep to be healthy. Ruthie touched his skin and pulled back. She'd never felt anything that hot before, not even from a stove left burning too long. Hazel's eyes went wide, hands shaking as she dipped a cloth in the basin. The child wouldn't drink, wouldn't open his eyes, wouldn't cry. That silence was the loudest thing in the room. By the time Colt stepped through the doorway, Ruthie was kneeling by the cot, whispering the baby's name like a prayer she wasn't sure she believed in. "He's burning up," she said, voice brittle. "I don't know what to do." Colt didn't answer. He walked past her, pulled the heavier coat from the hook, strapped his boots, and reached for his saddlebag. The snow had started again outside, not heavy but steady. Relentless in the way only February snow can be. "You can't ride in that," Hazel said. But he already had his hand on the door. He looked at Ruthie, not for permission, not for questions, just long enough to be sure she understood. "I'll be back," he said, and then he was gone. Ruthie stood there for a moment, chest hollow with everything unsaid. Hazel paced. The other children huddled near the stove, trying not to ask. Outside, the wind grew sharper. Inside, time slowed. The baby whimpered once, then went still again. No one slept. They took turns keeping him upright, pressing cool cloths to his skin, listening to the fire crackle like it could answer them. Ruthie watched the shadows on the walls grow longer, then shorter again, until she could finally see the sky begin to pale through the curtains. That's when they heard it. Hooves, fast, unapologetic. Colt swung down from the horse before it fully stopped. His face was raw from wind, eyes bloodshot. In one arm, a box of medicine. In the other, a doctor, half awake, coat flapping, muttering about frostbite and fools. No one said thank you right away. They didn't need to. They just moved aside so he could kneel beside the cot. Ruthie reached out, gently touched the back of his arm. "You didn't have to." "I did," he said. "Nothing more. Not to explain where the doctor came from. Not how he'd gotten across the pass in a storm or what he'd traded for the medicine in his pocket. Because love, real love, doesn't come with receipts. It doesn't wait to be justified. It doesn't pause for permission or calculate cost. It just rides through snow, through dark, through doubt, until the ones you care for are safe again. That morning the baby's fever broke. His breathing steadied. He slept at last in peace. And the man who rode through the cold didn't ask for rest. He just sat in the corner of the room, coat still on, boots dripping, watching the steam rise from a mug he hadn't touched. Love, Ruthie realized, isn't loud. It's not always warm. Sometimes it's just a man in silence, refusing to stay put when a child needs saving. And sometimes that's enough. The fence had been mended weeks ago. but the ground beside it still bore the memory of small hands, cold mornings, and quiet decisions. That's where Ruthie planted the peach tree. It was just a sapling, thin, trembling slightly in the wind. The kind of tree you'd walk past 100 times without noticing. But she knelt there anyway, pressed her palms into the soil like she was asking permission. Hazel watched from the porch, arms crossed. "It'll take years," she said. "I know," Ruthie answered. "So did we." The roots went in shallow but firm. The same way healing starts, not deep, not fast, but enough. The next day, Clara brought a ribbon to tie around the base. One of the boys added a circle of stones. A girl too small to speak clearly brought her blanket and laid it nearby, just in case the tree gets cold. They didn't ask what the tree was for. Maybe they already knew. Maybe every child who's ever had to start over understands the sacredness of something small, planted, and believed in. Ruthie didn't call it a monument, didn't call it anything. But every afternoon, after chores were done and the light turned gold, she sat beside it, back against the fence, and told stories. Not just her own, everyone's. She spoke of Clara's bravery, Hazel's silence turned into song, Colt's stubborn love, and of a baby whose fever broke because someone rode through snow without asking whether it was worth it. The younger ones sat in a half circle, some with open mouths, others chewing on their sleeves. They didn't always understand the timeline, but they understood the tone. They knew what safety sounded like. The tree didn't bloom that spring, but it held. It bent in the wind and stayed. That was enough. One evening, a new boy arrived, mud on his boots, a tear in his coat. He didn't speak, just stared at the tree, then at Ruthie, then looked away like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to hope. She didn't say anything. She just patted the ground beside her. And when he sat, still watching the sapling sway gently in the breeze, he whispered, "What kind of tree is it?" Ruthie smiled. "One that remembers." It was late again. The kind of late where the wind barely moved and the lamps hummed louder than the house breathed. Ruthie sat alone at the kitchen table, a folded piece of paper in front of her, blank on the outside but already heavy. She didn't write letters often, but tonight something in her needed to reach back, not to change the past but to leave a light on in it. So she began. "Dear Mama, though I never knew if I had one," she wrote. "Today I watched a boy learn how to whistle. I planted a peach tree last month, and Hazel told me it'll grow slowly. That made me smile. She says it like patience is a badge we've all earned." She wrote about the warm biscuit Colt once left on the windowsill, the one that made her believe kindness could be quiet and still count. She mentioned the baby, now sleeping without fever, and how his breathing felt like music no one had taught him. She didn't ask why no one had come for her back then. She just said, "If I ever meet you, I hope you know I'm safe now. I have a home. I know where to put my boots. People say my name when they're not angry." When she finished, she folded the paper twice, clean and even, no envelope, no stamp. She slid it into the drawer beside the tea leaves and didn't lock it, didn't hide it. Just placed it among other quiet things that had waited to be useful again. The next day, one of the younger children found it. She didn't mean to pry, just looking for sugar, maybe something sweet. When she asked, "Is this yours?" Ruthie nodded. The girl tilted her head, reading slowly, lips moving without sound. When she finished, she looked up. "I think people can be each other's parents," she said, "even if they didn't make you." Ruthie blinked. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think so too." No one mailed the letter, but its message had already arrived, in the way that love, once lived out loud, doesn't need delivery. It just needs to be noticed. And in that moment, as the kettle began to sing again, Ruthie knew some things are too full to be spoken. The afternoon sun stretched across the floorboards like an old dog finding its favorite spot. Somewhere in the house, pots clanged, laughter bubbled, and the baby giggled for no reason anyone could explain. Ruthie was folding laundry by the window, the same one she used to stare out of in silence. A little girl wandered over, barefoot, with strawberry jam still on her chin. She tugged gently at Ruthie's skirt. "Miss Ruthie," she asked, eyes wide, "what happened next?" Ruthie paused, held the towel in mid-fold, and smiled. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned and pointed out toward the yard, toward the peach tree, now with buds barely opening, toward Hazel reading aloud beneath it, Clara braiding a girl's hair, the boys rolling in laughter over something none of the grown-ups would ever understand. "That," Ruthie said softly, "is what happened next." The camera pulls back. The porch, the fields, the patched-up fence. The house not large but lived in. A home held together not by blueprints, but by stubborn grace, shared bread, and the choice to stay. And out in that yard, under a sky that once felt too far away, the children run. They don't know they're the ending of a story once filled with silence, and the beginning of another, a better one, because a truly good story never really ends. It just waits for the next child to ask, "Then what happened?" And